Hey, hello all. In this session, we are going to see about private endpoint. So let's see. So what is private endpoint? Okay, private endpoint is nothing but a network interface that helps to secure a resource so that it can be accessed only using a private IP address. Okay, so this private endpoint makes sure that any Azure resource can be brought into a virtual network, and this can be accessed only using a private IP address. Okay, so let's take a look at this diagram, so it will help us to understand it better. Okay, so now assume we are connected to the Azure portal, and I'm going to create a new SQL Server database. Okay, so when I'm creating the SQL Server database, let's say that I'm setting this public access enabled. Okay, so what will happen? I will be able to connect to this SQL Server database using my laptop, or anyone with internet and laptop with a software application like SQL Developer or SQL Server Management Studio installed would be able to connect to this SQL Server database. But that shouldn't be the case in the real-time scenario, right? Because users will not like any database to be exposed to the real world, because this database will have sensitive information, like it can have like customers data, sales data, I mean anything. This can be like sensitive information, and the clients they don't want this database to be exposed to the public network. Okay, so how to secure this within a virtual network? So private endpoint will help this use case. Okay, so what private endpoint does, when we introduce a private endpoint and link this SQL database, I mean, or SQL server to this private endpoint, what will happen? This SQL server automatically will be brought within this virtual network. Yeah. So this private endpoint will be created, and this private endpoint will be attached to this VNet's subnet. Okay. Then after associating this SQL server to this private endpoint, this SQL server and its database automatically will be, will be brought in as part of this virtual network. Okay. So after that, you won't be able to access this SQL Server database using a public device. You can only access this using this virtual machine, because this virtual machine is also part of this VNet. Okay, so that's why I'm saying I just crossed here. So this access will not be available no longer after this endpoint creation, and I'll have to connect from my laptop to this virtual machine using this virtual machine's IP address, like public IP address, and then I'll have to connect from this virtual machine to this SQL server using this private endpoint connection. Okay, right. So let's go into the demo. I would like to list down the list of steps that we will follow as part of this demo. First, I'll be creating a virtual network and subnet snet-vm. I'll be creating a VM and associate to this subnet. Then I will create a SQL server and database with sample data. Now I will show that I'll be able to connect to this database from my laptop. Okay, I'll be using an application called SQL Server Management Studio to connect. Then I'll be creating a new subnet called snet private endpoint. Then what I will do, I'll be creating a new private endpoint and associate it to this private endpoint, to this subnet. Then I will configure my SQL Server to use this private endpoint, and also I will disable the public connectivity of SQL Server. So in this case, what will happen? This SQL Server is brought to be part of that virtual network. So only using virtual machine that is part of this virtual network, this SQL server can be accessed. So that is the idea, right? To make sure the public access to the SQL server is blocked, so that the SQL server can be accessed only within the resources that is part of that virtual network. That is the complete idea of this exercise. Okay. Let me go to the Azure portal. Okay. So first, let me start with creating a virtual network. I'm creating a new virtual network. I'm using an existing resource tool. I'm going to name this virtual network as VNet1. I'm going to choose West US3. Next, IP addresses. I'm going to delete this default subnet, and I'm going to give my space here 10.0.0.0/16. Now I'm going to add a new subnet. This subnet I'm going to name it as snet-vm, because I'll be creating the VM and associating with this subnet. So I'm naming this accordingly, snet-vm. Then 0.0.0.0/24. Okay, add. Then I'm fine with all other options. So I'm going to review and create. Then running the validation. Okay, let me create this. Okay, while this is getting created, let me open another tab so I can start with my virtual machine creation. Okay, so my recent services virtual machine is there. Yeah, it is there. I'm clicking on this. We're going to create a new virtual machine. Selecting the existing resource group. I'm going to name this virtual machine as just VM1. Okay, region, let me choose this West US3. So availability options, all I'm fine with this. So image is nothing but operating system. So it is a default that is showing Windows Server 2016. I'm fine with this. If you want, you can choose Linux or any other OS you want, but I'm okay to go with Windows 2016. And the size, okay, let me choose DS1. Okay, I have to give a ID password for this VM. Okay, I have given the ID and password. Okay, so by default, it is saying allow selected ports and it is allowing this RDP port. Yeah, I'm fine with this option. Okay, because there should be a way I should be able to connect to this VM, right? Then only I'd be able to connect to this database once the database is brought to the private endpoint, right? So for that purpose, I'm allowing the RDP port. Okay, so I'm going to next disks. So I'm fine with all these options. Next, networking. Okay, so automatically, because there is only one virtual network, it got selected and it has taken that only available subnet also. So I'm fine with this. Public IP, yes, I need the public IP. So I'm fine with that. It's all fine. Next, management. I'm disabling the boot diagnostics. Next, advanced. Next, tags. Review, create. Okay, so running its validation. Okay, validation passed. I'm creating this virtual machine. Okay, so let this virtual machine be deployed in the backend. Let me go to the other tab and start creating my SQL Server and its database. Okay, so here the virtual network deployment has completed. Now I'm going to create a SQL database. Okay, so I have to search. So already the SQL database is there in my recent services. I'm choosing this. I'm going to create a new SQL database. So whenever you are going to create a new SQL database, first a logical server must be created. So that's how it is. You have to create a logical server, and within that server, you have to create the database. Okay, so I'm going to choose the subscription, then resource group. Then before giving the database name, I have to give the server. So I don't have an existing SQL server, so I'm going to create one newly. So this name should be unique across all the subscriptions, all Azure portals. Okay, so SAN, I'll give a SQL Server 157. Okay, so this is available. I'm going with this. Location, let me choose this also to use West US 3. Okay, so here you have multiple authentication methods. One is SQL authentication. Another one is to use Azure AD. Azure AD is nothing but when we can create Azure Active Directory groups, and we also can add this so that any users that are added to the group can access the SQL database. But in this case, for demo purpose, I'm just going to stick only to the SQL authentication. Okay, yeah. So let me set this ID password for this SQL. I'm going to set as SQL admin. Sorry, typo. SQL admin. Okay, so I have given a SQL server. So I have created a logical SQL server now. I'm giving OK. Okay, so the SQL server has been created. Now I'm going to create a database which will be appearing under this logical server. So I'm going to name this as SQL DB underscore demo. That is fine. Okay, it is asking some to use something called elastic pool. I don't want to use elastic pool. So, okay, compute storage. See, in SQL, when you're creating this Azure SQL database, right, you have like multiple options to create your server and database. You have the concept of elastic pool, you have the concept of hyperscale, you have serverless, and also the purchasing model. You have like DTU based model, vCore based model. It is a vast topic. It is a vast topic. Let me explain that in another session. But for now, I'm going to go with this DTU. DTU is nothing but database transaction unit. I'm going to go with this DTU based purchasing model. So, but I'm going to increase the number of DTUs. So I'm clicking on this. If you see here, the service tier contains two options, and within this there are like multiple options. There is something called vCore DTU based. I'm going with DTU based model only and standard, and I'm going to choose my DTU, that is database transaction unit, maybe to be 100. I'm going to apply this. Okay, so there is this backup storage. This backup storage is used to backup your database. There are two backups called point-in-time retention backup and long-term retention backup. Again, this also I will explain on another demo session. But for now, I'm going with the least, backup option, which is locally redundant backup storage. So just to give you a quick information, what it does is it creates the backup copies of your database, so that in case of any database corruption or any failure, you can restore your data. So that's the main idea about this. And when it says locally zone geo, it's a different ways how your backup is stored. Okay, right. So if you go for geo, you will have your databases backups stored in multiple different regions basically. So the availability SLA is more in this case, but in this case for demo, I'm just going with locally redundant backup storage. Okay. Next, I'm going to networking. So in this networking, by default, it is created with this no access, but I should be able to access this in a particular way, right? So to start with, I'm going to use this public endpoint. Okay. Okay. So then again, it asks two options. You want Azure resources to access this, add current IP address. So let me go with the default no, and let me create this. I will show you what it is. Okay. So start free trial. I don't want this defender. I'm going giving not now. It's all fine. Collation, I'm going with default. Okay, so this is one good option here. See, you can create either your database as a blank database by selecting the option none, which is the default. Otherwise, you can create your database by using an existing database in Azure, so that you can use a backup and you can use the database. But in this case, I want to create a sample database. Azure itself is giving a sample database for the users to to exploring different options to want to work with. So I'm going to use that option sample. Yeah, it will ask, it will change, but no worries, I'll just do okay. So next tags, review create. I'm going to create this database. So first it will validate and then it will create. Okay, so this database creation will take some time. Meanwhile, let me go and see if the virtual machine has got created. Yeah, so the virtual machine has got created. Okay, so now because this database creation will take some time, let me pause and resume the video once it gets created. Okay. Okay, so the database has got created. So let me go to resource. Okay, if you see here, this is the SQL Server and this is the database. Okay, so now I'm in this SQL DB underscore demo is a database. Now I'm in the database. Okay, okay, so there is an option here to check or query your database. Let me try to see if I can see the data. Okay, if you remember, I created this database with some sample data, right? So I should be able to see the data. Let me see what happens. Okay, so what it says, cannot open server, client with the IP address, it's not allowed. So this is nothing but my laptop's IP address. Okay, so if you remember, I created this database with public access, but I didn't add any IP address that can access this database, right? Okay, so let's do that. for doing this, I mean, to do any networking or any configuration, you will have to use this SQL Server only. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to home, and that is fine. And I'm going to choose my resource group. And within this resource group, I'll be going to my SQL Server. So I'm clicking on the SQL Server. So whenever it is about access, anything related to networking, everything will be under this blade, networking only. So I'm clicking on this networking. And if you see here, the public access is enabled, but there is no, if you see here, this rule should be allowed. This rule should be created so that I can access this SQL database from my laptop. So what I'm going to do, default, right? It automatically has a default rule, and it asks add your client IP address. So this is my laptop's IP address. I'm going with this option. Or I can even add a firewall rule and say to allow. But in this case, this is very easy to do. So I'm going to add your client IP address. So it is done. I'm going to click on save. Okay, so it is done. So now I will be able to access this database. So I'm clicking on this server. Within the server, you can see this option like databases. See, right? Databases. Click on that. And again, you have to click on this database. Now you will find that query editor. So I will be able to access and see the data now. Okay. So I can see under this database, we have like multiple tables, right? So these tables are all part of the sample database that Azure provides us. So I'm also going to try accessing this database from my laptop, not from the portal, from my laptop using a software application called SQL Server Management Studio. So I'm clicking on this database engine. So I have to copy the server name. So to copy the server name, I'll have to go here, click on this server. That is fine. I'm okay. So when you click on this server, you will find this server name here. So I'm copying this server name, and I'm going to log into this server from my laptop's software application. So yeah, SQL admin is my ID. So I'm going to provide the password here. Connect. Okay. Okay. So if you see here, yeah, SQL database was created, and I am able to connect with my laptop, which is connected to the internet. Okay. But that should not be the case in real time, because this is just a demo, but in real time, the database can have sensitive data, and the clients or the end users would not like this to happen. So they would like to restrict that database so that it is accessible only by dedicated machines within a virtual network, like that. So I'm just going to show you just sample data. See, I'm just selecting some sample data to show you here. Right. Okay. Now let's see what are all the steps we have completed and what are all the pending steps. So we have created this virtual networks and subnet. We have created VM and associated to this subnet. We created SQL Server and a database with sample data, and we connected to this database using my laptop, right? Using a software application called SQL Server Management Studio. Now is the important steps where we are going to create a private endpoint. So first, to create a private end, before creating this private endpoint, I'm going to create a new subnet called snet-pvt-endpoint. Okay, let me go to the portal again. So I'll have to go to my virtual network so I can add this new subnet. I'm going to VNet. I'm going to subnets, create a new subnet. I'm going to name the subnet as snet-private endpoint. Okay, so if you see this IP address has been selected automatically by Azure, and I'm fine with that. So I'm going to save this. Okay. Now the next step is to create a private endpoint, associate the SQL Server to that private endpoint, and associate that private endpoint to this subnet, right? So for that, I'm going to the next tab. Let me go to home, and let me go to resource group and let me select the SQL Server. So I'm going to click on the SQL Server. Okay. So first, what I'm going to do now, again, for anything related to the network, disabling and enabling access, all those things will fall under this networking blade only. So first, I'm going to disable this public access. By disabling this, what will happen? Any public access, if at all, will be disabled. So this is the first step. Next step is I'm going to this private access. I'm going to create a new private endpoint. See, it automatically prompts us to create a new private endpoint. I'm going to name this as SQL DB hyphen private endpoint. Okay, so it automatically creates a network interface. That's fine. So I'm going to choose the same region based US3 itself. Next, resource. Okay, so now here it will allow us. Okay, so because I'm creating from SQL Server, it automatically has taken this resource to SQL Server, which is well and good. So next, I'm going to the virtual network. So here I have to associate this private endpoint to an subnet. So because I had created a dedicated subnet, right? I'm going to choose that. Okay, yeah. So I'm fine with all this. Next, DNS, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm good with all other options. So I'm going to next tags, review, create. Sorry. Okay, validation has passed. I'm going to create. So now just think what has happened. What we did is we created a private endpoint. That private endpoint we created from the SQL Server itself, and we have associated this with the subnet to an existing virtual network. And also we have disabled the public access to this SQL Server. Now what will happen is the access to this SQL Server database from my laptop, right? That would have got disabled. And since this SQL Server also has been added to this virtual network, we will be able to communicate only with any other devices that are part of this virtual network. So the virtual machine which we had created, that is also part of this virtual network, right? So we can access this database via that virtual machine. Okay. So that's the main idea, right? We want to restrict this database to be accessed via public network or internet, because the database will have confidential data and we don't want that to happen. So we have restricted public access to this database now. Now the next step is I will connect to this virtual machine using the public IP address of virtual machine from my laptop. I use this RDP or remote desktop connect to this virtual machine, and from the virtual machine, maybe I'll try to install this software application called SQL Server Management Studio, and I will see if I'm able to connect to this database. Okay, so let me do that. So this private endpoint is getting deployed. It will take some time. Meanwhile, let me remote connect to this virtual machine. Okay, so I'm going to take the public IP address of the virtual machine. So I'm clicking on the virtual machine. So this is the public IP address. I'm copying this public IP address. I'm going to remote connect to this virtual machine. Yeah, so remote desktop connection. Provide the IP address here. I have to specify my username, which I supplied during my creation of this VM, right? Connect. Okay. So this is getting created. Okay. So once we log into the virtual machine, there are multiple ways to check your access to the server. You can use ping and you can try if that works also. But I'm just going to create this software application that is SSMS or SQL Server Management Studio, and I'm going to connect to the SQL database and show you how it is working now. Okay. Yeah. So let this load. Okay, got it. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to install this software, right? So I'm going to open this website. and find this software installation. Remember, I'm inside my, I'm inside this virtual machine, okay? You ask me later. I'm going to go with this. This. Okay, so the software that I'm going to install is called SQL Server Management Studio. So I'm just searching for SQL Server Management Studio installation. Doesn't matter. So I'm going to download this SSM. In short, it's called SSMS. I'm going to download this SSMS software. Here it is. It's a free download only, so you can download it as you want. Okay, it is asking to save the dump. I'm saving it. Okay, let me pause this recording and reconnect, because this may take a few minutes. To save your time, I'm going to pause this recording. Okay, so this SSMS software has got installed completely. Okay, so now what I want to show you is, after using that private endpoint, right? I mean, after configuring this private endpoint and adding the database server to be part of this private endpoint, what happens now? I'm able to connect to this SQL Server only using this virtual machine. So what I did, I connected to this virtual machine using remote desktop connection from my laptop. Now within this virtual machine, I'm going to connect to this SQL Server database. Okay. Let me just minimize this. Go to start. Okay. So this is the new software that I installed. I'm going to select this. So again, I need to use I need to provide the SQL Server, SQL Server name, and then log into the database, right? So meanwhile, let me check if the private endpoint has got completed. Yeah, it has got deployed also, completely deployed. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the SQL Server name and use that to log in to the SQL Server from the virtual machine. Okay, so I'm clicking on the server. Okay, so this is the server name. I'm copying this. I'm going inside the virtual machine. So here I'm giving the server name. Okay, so authentication should be SQL Server authentication. I'm going to give the ID here and password. Sorry, the ID is SQL. SQL ADM. Okay. Connect. Okay. So yeah. So we are able to connect to this database, whatever we created, using the virtual machine. Okay. Just to show you some sample data. Okay. Yeah. So these are all the steps involved in creating a SQL database and configuring a private endpoint so that it can be connected only from the virtual machine. Okay. So just to recap, let me show you the steps what we did. We created virtual network, then VM, then SQL Server database. Then first I connected from my laptop via internet. Then I created this private endpoint and configured this SQL Server to use this private endpoint. And then finally I used my virtual machine and I have connected to this SQL Server database. Okay. Hope you enjoy this session and you would have understood something about private endpoint, I believe. If you really like the session, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much, guys. Catch you later. Bye.